I'll say that l'chaim as well. Whenever you share holy words or spiritual words or any words that help people in their lives, in the merit of anyone, obviously it's a great way of channeling blessings in their lives. Because we live in a very materialistic and transient world. Everything is very temporary, short-lived. But when you do something that has a hopefully a permanent impact, so when you study Torah in a way that affects us all, in a way that inspires us, in ways that go long after, that last long after this hour and a half we spend together, then the merit of the soul or the person that you're doing it for forever is forever is impacted and enhanced by our learning. That's why studying Torah or doing another mitzvah or charity or any other good deed which is lasting and permanent is the greatest way to give somebody the gift that lasts forever. You know, we always have many gifts. Most gifts don't last very long, especially the material ones, but there are gifts that last forever. So in honor of this class, may your mother have a complete refuah shlema, and your wife, and you should have the least amount of aggravation, and spend most of the time, all the time, only on good things and on good matters. Right. And with that, I also, being that we're in the month of the Hebrew month of Adar, which is a month of joy, this year it's a double month of joy. So I think it's appropriate as well, because each of us, we should all be blessed with many healthy, good years, but who doesn't have challenges in their lives? So it's interesting that joy is always comes hand in hand with its alter ego, which is pain. You know, the joy, when someone says they're celebrating joy, it's not a neutral state. It means that there's something that they're either being freed of. Joy is a more than natural state, so it's usually some form of redemption or salvation from something that brings someone joy. Whether it's the birth of a child, whether it's a marriage, whether it's a form of healing, or in the case of Jewish history, our exodus from Egypt, or in this month, the month of Purim, the holiday of Purim, after literally being at the brink of the abyss, the Jewish people were saved. Obviously, these things create a tremendous amount of joy, because the contrast of darkness only glaringly focuses on the amount of joy that we should be having in life. And whether for good or for bad, the human beings usually do not appreciate when things are going well. We take for granted our blessings. We should all have blessings, but the fact of the matter is you usually appreciate them much more when they follow some form of crack or some form of setback. As our good friend Leonard Cohen tells us, that the cracks are there to let the light in. So life is, or to use Hemingway's words, even though his end was actually quite counter his words, that life breaks all people and some are stronger in the broken places. He wasn't one of those, some, because he ended up being too broken. But the statement is still a true one. And from the Jewish perspective, as the Jewish people as a whole, collectively and also individually, who's a better model, an example of resilience and the ability to go through literally the harshest and the most difficult challenges until the latest Holocaust 70 years ago, and still remain standing and still be able to rebound and rebuild, which isn't just a technical thing, but also to have the spirit, to have the presence of mind, to have the ability to have the fortitude not to be resigned. I mean, just think about 1945. Just imagine yourself. Besides the 6 million that were killed and the families that were indirectly impacted, I mean, everything was in shatters. The entire Jewish world, as it was known for almost 1,000 years in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, disappeared. So whoever remained was wandering the streets of Europe, the ruins of Europe, you can say, looking for something. No one even knew. Some people thought there were no Jews left. So the demoralization could destroy any individual, especially a people. And yet, look now, we're now in the year 2016, and not that everything is perfect, but we did not die. I did some research. I looked at the obituary columns in the 1945 and so on, and everybody was predicting that the Jewish people would no longer exist by the year 1990, because the last Jews would die. Assimilation was destroying the Jewish people in the United States. Remember, there was no Israel in 1945, and the best and the brightest were mostly killed. I mean, all the leaders, rabbis, teachers. You left with remnants, with orphans and widows and widowers, and no families, no country. So naturally, you would predict the demise. After a certain point, everyone would die out. And what happened? It didn't happen. Now they predict that in 20 years from now, Europe will be a Muslim continent. That pretty much is almost a given, because the birth rate in Europe is whatever, 1.8, and they say whenever the birth rate is 1.8, if you don't, you cannot replace yourself, and especially if you have an insurgence of other populations. So it's an inevitability. And yet the Jewish people with far less numbers were able to survive. And I'm not trying to pull rank, or maybe I am trying to pull rank. Why not? We've been around for 3,500 years, after all, 4,000 years, so we might as well be proud of it. So they say the Chinese, they don't respect anybody except Jews. Not because they like Jews, but because they like longevity. As Chow and Lai said to the Western reporters when China opened up in the early 70s, President Nixon, if you remember him. So China opened up, so it was the first time the Western world had access to China. China was a closed country, completely closed. So the question they asked Chow and Lai, he was the prime minister at the time, they asked him, so what do you think about the American Revolution, or the French and American Revolution? And his classic answer was, it's too early to tell. Because it was only 300 years old, and the Chinese civilization is 1,500 years, and the Jews are almost 4,000 years. So there you go. Everyone in business knows, you want to know what is the secret for staying power. If you had a business that stays in business for 3,500 years, they must be doing something right. Even though as Jews ourselves, internally, we know we got plenty of problems. Like the classic joke where they say the Jewish guy's reading anti-Semitic newspapers. He says, why are you reading anti-Semitic newspapers? He says, because it makes me feel good. When I read the Jewish newspapers, they talk about all the fighting and the infighting with this community, that community. You read an anti-Semitic newspaper, the Jews control Hollywood. They control the banks. They control the world. They control politics. Makes me feel good, Little do they know that we barely can control our own synagogues, but that's the inside secret. So from the outside, it looks like we've been here forever, and we have actually been, so I think it's important to state that. And at the same time, we have our challenges. I'm not dismissing them, but I think at times it's important, especially now, it's a month of joy. Why is it a joy? Because in the Megillah, Esther, in the book of Esther, which we will read in a few weeks on Purim, it talks and literally speaks about that after Haman, who was like a Hitler, and some say even worse, because he basically had the power to completely annihilate the Jewish people. Persia controlled, as the Megillah opens up, 127 nations, and the Jews were all there. There were no Jews on the other side of the continent. They were all under the control of the Persian Empire. And literally, they could have had a total genocide. And instead, as the Megillah puts it, it was transformed. It was transformed into tremendous joy, which is why it's called it HaChodesh Asher Nepach Lahem. That's the expression in the verse, the month that was transformed for them. That's the literal translation. Like we say it actually every night, every Havdalah, in the Havdalah service after Shabbos, we refer to it. We say, La Yehudim Hoysa Erev V'Simcha V'Sasni Yakar, that section that we all say out loud, is a verse from the Megillah, that the Jews had joy and celebration, 4 different expressions of their celebration, all due to the fact that they came out of a tremendous danger, and we remember it till this day, which is why this month, not just the day, that's how Jews work. One day is a day of tragedy, we turn it into a month of celebration, which is, by the way, a tremendous lesson in healing, a psychological lesson that many modern contemporary psychological healing systems emulate, and that is you never allow a negative to just be eradicated. It has to be turned into a positive. A liability must become an asset. Just to give you an example, besides the Purim example, which is obvious, you could say, listen, they almost killed us, fine. So we were saved. Why do we still have to remember 2,500 years later, this miracle? What relevance does it have? But the fact of the matter is, when you suffer and you don't just come out of it, you become stronger. What they say is that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And that's absolutely true, especially psychologically. Because if you go through a difficult situation and you make it, it has tested your mettle and has strengthen you in a way that that test can never destroy you again, because you've seen you can go through even the harshest experience. And if you don't do that, then what happens is you may have a clean slate that you've erased, so-called a negative, but when you turn it into a positive, in some way, in a strange way, it redeems the negative. And don't underestimate, this is a tremendous lesson in life, because we all will have and have had situations, I'm sure, that were challenging, and we love that they disappear. That's great, but more than just disappear, learn something from them. Become a greater person from them, and you'll see the magic happens. And that's really one of the big secrets of this element. I'll give you another example. You go Saturday to the synagogue shul. There's the reading of the Torah every week. Now, after the reading of the entire chapter, like this week they'll be reading Vayakel, the last chapter, next to last chapter in the book of Exodus. So every week is another one of the 52 chapters corresponding to the 52 weeks of the year. So after the reading of the Torah comes another reading. It's called the Haftarah, which is a selection from one of the books of the prophets that deals usually with the topic of the chapter of the Torah. The question is, why do we read the Haftarah? I don't know if you've ever wondered or ever heard. It's a very interesting reason. It was actually a Yiddish seichel solution for a major problem. And that was what? That during the time of the Romans, they determined that the Jews studying Torah and reading Torah is a threat to them. Why it's a threat, I'm not really sure, but that's what they felt. And they decided to prohibit any reading or studying Torah. Okay? And anyone caught reading the Torah could be killed, would be killed. So the Jews couldn't read the Torah, Shabbos, in the synagogues. So what did they do? They came up with a brilliant legal loophole. And that was, when someone asks you what the Torah is, most people know the Torah is a very large part of literature. It's not just limited. But you could also define it limited. You could say the Torah is only the written Torah, which is the 5 books, what we call the 5 books of Chumash, from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, or in the Hebrew, Bereshis, Shmois, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Dvarim. So the Jews said, okay, we're not reading that. We're reading something that is not the Torah. It's called Tanakh, Nach, from the prophets. And they found the essential theme of the written Torah. They found it somewhere in the prophets, and that's what was read for those years that this decree was. And the Romans, what do they know? They don't know how to read Torah anyway. So bottom line was they were able to continue the tradition. Okay. Then the day came that this law was abolished. So you think, okay, fine. Now we go back to the reading of the Torah. No need for the Haftarah. Doesn't work that way. For Jews, it was always known. You add something good, you never stop it, even if it came for a bad reason. Which is, again, it's not just a nice statement. Think about it psychologically. It means that nothing can destroy you. Because something negative, it can become a positive, and then the positive remains forever. So till this day, we have an additional reading, which most of us see as a blessing. No one remembers that it was based on some negative. So the only thing that the Romans left us was an extra reading in Torah. So basically, every anti-Semite and every enemy of the Jewish people, what did they give us? They gave us extra holidays. That's what happened. Pharaoh and the Egyptians gave us Passover. Haman and Achashverosh gave us Purim. Hanukkah was given to us by the Greeks. Every one of them. So they're all an outgrowth. It's like the pearl. The natural pearl. You know how a natural pearl is formed? It's the secretion of an oyster due to the irritation caused by dust. So the oyster has a very, very, very tender and gentle and sensitive underbelly, almost like very, very sensitive. So when the piece of dust falls onto that, ends up in that part of the skin, the oyster releases a certain secretion, like a liquid, that hardens and becomes a pearl. So the beautiful pearls that we consider to be ornaments, I'm talking about natural pearls, not cultured ones or whatever Walter Matthau would say, look at this, it's authentic imitation leather type of thing. I'm talking about the actual authentic, is basically a result of an irritated oyster. That's what it comes down to. And if you think about it, a lot of beauty in this world, if you trace the roots, you'll usually find some type of annoyance or some aggravation that brought that. All perfume, frankly, natural perfume also comes not exactly from great smells. They just extract the toxins. So it leaves a powerful, positive aroma. And on and on and on. This in Jewish thought, especially in Kabbalistic and mystical Chassidic thought, is called ishapcha, It's an Aramaic word, comes from the Zohar. It means not just to stop something, but to transform it. It's very different to just end a challenge. It's another to transform it into an asset, which means that anything that happens in our lives, even though it may have been unwelcome and unwanted and completely negative at the time, but after the fact, you have the power to grow and become a greater person from it. So, of course, this is related to the theme of the dedication of this class as well. But also, this is the reason they titled the class, When Half is More Than Whole. Okay, which, of course, seems counterintuitive, because you don't need to be a mathematician to know that half is half of whole. Right? 2 halves make a whole. So how can you say that half is more than whole? So obviously it provokes us into think about it, that beyond the world of numbers, and remember there's other parts of life, not everything is a mathematical equation. Not everything is just pure numbers. There are other things in life. So for example, tell me what is more complete. A person who thinks that they're completely finished, they're a finished product, or someone who knows that there's so much more to grow. Which one would you call a more complete human being? That throws us a little more. Mathematically, you think someone that's complete, like, it's a finished, the bread has been baked. It's a baked piece of a loaf of bread. But in human life, especially in the psyche and the soul, the exact opposite is true. Anyone that makes a statement, I have reached the peak of my knowledge, I have no more to know, I know everything there is to know, how would you look at a person like that? Besides arrogant, you wouldn't see them exactly as a complete person, you'd see them as a blinded. Because the whole point of human growth, human spirit is about growth, and growth is never ending. Nobody wants to ever know that you've come to a point there's no more to go. So when it comes to the real things in life, mathematics is numbers. It's about measuring things. But if you talk about things that are more ethereal, you'll find the exact opposite is true. That the less complete it is, the more whole it is. So there's actually an expression, a Yiddish expression coming from Chassidic masters, where they say, I'll try to translate it. Yiddish, it really rhymes well. I'll say it, anyone knows Yiddish here? Okay. The man in the red beard says he knows some Yiddish. Okay, huh? Okay. Doesn't matter. Yiddish sounds good even if you don't know it. In fact, it has a nice ring to it. I'll translate it regardless. So it says, they say like this. Es ist nicht ein krummere Sache wie a Gleichwörtel. Es ist nicht eine gleichere Sache wie a krumme Letter. Und es ist nicht eine ganze Sache wie a zerbrochene Hart. Anyone got that? Okay. Goes like this. There's nothing as crooked as a straight lie. There's nothing as straight as a crooked ladder. Right? And there's nothing as complete as a broken heart. That's the expression. So the first two obviously are quite obvious because, straight lie, like a white lie, can be much more crooked than a blatant lie. And of course, a straight ladder is not very useful. A ladder has to be crooked, has to be on an angle, on a slant. So there's nothing as straight as a crooked ladder in the sense there's nothing more effective. And then the final statement, there's nothing as complete as a broken heart. What does that mean exactly? Again, it seems paradoxical. So I'll just share with you a memory just came to me. I'm sure all of you have been to Israel, Jerusalem. Anybody not been? It's not relevant. I'll describe what I saw. I remember one Friday. So Friday is beautiful to go down from the Rova, which is the Jewish quarter. You go down to the Kotel, to the wall. Jews from all backgrounds. It's the only synagogue where everybody's welcome. And all the different minions and all that, everything going on there. You come down there Friday evening. So I remember walking down the steps. The steps you walk down from the quarter. As you go, and you're on top of the steps, you see the beautiful gold mosque, the gold dome of the Dome of the Rock. If you look to the right, there's a more silver or gray dome for the Alaska mosque. And as you walk down, the domes disappear, and you end up seeing just this wall. Now, as you also know, especially on Fridays and Sundays, Jerusalem has 4 quarters. The old city. It has the Jewish quarter, it has the Muslim quarter, it has the Christian quarter, and it has the Armenian quarter. Don't ask me how the Armenians got into there, but they're there. Okay. I think it was some payoff from the Turks to what they did to the Armenians. I think they gave them a quarter, when they split it up. As well, so the 3 major religions, of course, and when the church bells start ringing, the angelic bells, So you could see literally see the contrast of three major religions. You have the bells of the churches. You have these mosques, these architectural, beautiful mosques. And what do we have as Jews? One barely broken wall. And I remember thinking about walking down the steps and saying, wow, that's interesting contrast. And you start thinking, like, who has the complete picture? The mosques are gorgeous. I mean, I never saw them close. I was never inside them, but you see the images, the pictures. You know, they're well built, they're beautiful, and so on. The bells are, as I said, angelic. They make you think, you know, whatever. And we have barely a broken wall. So you ask yourself, which one is the most complete of them all? And I think it's pretty clear that a broken wall can be more complete than all these beautiful architecture. I'll tell you why. If the world was a beautiful place, so fine. So then beautiful edifices and beautiful experiences reflect on the natural beauty of the world. But when the world is a hostile place, an ugly place, and people are cosmetically covering it up with beautiful stuff, that's actually part of the so-called, part of the illness. You know, they call in psychology denial. You know, so here's an interesting custom that everybody's familiar with. At a chuppah, which is the high point of a Jewish ceremony, chuppah, the wedding ceremony, under the canopy, a young couple, or a young older couple, who doesn't matter, not age is not the factor here, a couple who are in love with each other, have just finished, gotten sanctified their marriage, kiddushin, under a chuppah. So it's like one of the most high points of a person's life. You know, hopefully it stays that way the rest of their lives. We won't go into what happens often a while later. But let's assume that it stays that way. So then a strange thing, after the chuppah and the 7 blessings and everything that's done, there's this custom of breaking a glass, right? Put a glass under the foot of the groom, and he smashes the glass, breaks it into pieces. And everybody yells, Mazel Tov. What's the significance of this breaking of the glass? So I'm sure you've heard different sermons and speeches given under different chuppahs. Everyone has their reasons. There's the funny reasons, there's the serious reasons, the historical reasons. But here's a reason, I don't know if you've heard of this, or if you have, great. So, you know, there's the prerequisite joke they always say that, you know, may this, I don't know if it's a joke, that this should be the only thing that ever breaks is the glass. And the marriage should stay intact. Which is a little forced in a way, you know, why would you start breaking things? Or some say this is the last time the man will ever put his foot down, you know, so that's where they do it. As I said, there's all the different humor. The sexist humor, the anti-sexist humor, all the stuff going on. But here's one of the reasons, and it's a very powerful reason, and that is that even at the height of your joy, we have to remain humble. Because there are other people, we live in a world and not everybody is happy. So even the height of joy, you remember humbly that we still live in a broken world. And Jerusalem is still a broken place. And until we don't have messianic times of world peace and a temple rebuilt and no more suffering and pain and injustice, you can't just go ahead and 100% celebrate without acknowledging that. So it's a sign of recognizing, don't be haughty in your celebration. And interestingly, the twist goes both ways. Because a person who's suddenly so celebrated, so happy at that moment, and can't remember someone that's in need and someone that may not be happy that moment, think about it the other way around. The day comes when a person, God forbid, is in difficult moments, and they also will be 100% difficult and will not have one inkling of hope that something could get better. So the idea that you celebrate 99% and you reserve 1% to humbly acknowledge that there's more to life than your personal experience right now, will also one day serve you well, that one day, God forbid, should you be in a difficult situation, it also won't be 100% hopeless. And there's always a 1% chance and hope that things will get better. So if you think of it that way, in other words, whether we celebrate or whether we're not celebrating, there's always an understanding there's a bigger picture than just you and I. There's always understanding it's not about you and you alone. It's an ultimate state of humility, especially when you're celebrating. So if you think of it that way, it's an unbelievable, compassionate custom. It's saying that even as happy as I am right now, I do not forget those that are not that happy, and I pray for them, and I want them to be happy as well. So besides the collective responsibility we have for each other, it's also a sense of sensitivity in those moments, and you then will be remembered as well in times of need even though should never have a time of need, but we all have our downs and ups and downs. So that is a tremendous lesson. And that, in a sense, explains very much why we break the glass. It says to remember the destruction of the temple, which, of course, begs the question, as I said, why do we have to remember the destruction of the temple? Why of all times now? Let the couple. There'll be plenty of destruction in their lives. What do you need to force it during the wedding? Because that's life. We live in a world that is not complete. So, building beautiful edifices is a great thing, but the wall reflects life much more than any other symbol, because it reflects that life is, on one hand, not complete, but still the wall stands and has withstood the battles of time. That's, as I said, a tremendous lesson. I remember, I don't know, it was years ago, this class, I'm now going now steadily since 1982. Imagine. There were no fax machines, there were no emails. We used typewriters. I used a typewriter then. Most of you have never seen a typewriter, probably, right? It's a museum piece. Yeah, I still have my old typewriter somewhere stacked away. You should try using it, So I remember, the class of the people coming here were mostly from the arts and entertainment industry. At that time, that was the core group. So we had very interesting conversations. It was an interesting contrast as well. I came from a traditional Chabad Chassidic home. People coming to the class were more, I would say, far from traditional, very spiritual, very soulful, musical, and so on. But they would say that their spirituality came more from Zen Buddhism and a thing called LSD and stuff like that. Okay, so it was interesting comparing notes of different transcendental experiences, the psychedelic version and let's call it the natural version, which I tried to share with them. And I remember I was once sitting in a class. This was when I was still giving the class in Brooklyn. And on the table there were oranges and some apples and some coffee beans and some other stuff, some refreshments. And I don't know, I began to talk about a mystical concept, a Chassidic concept, really taken from the second section of Tanya, Volume 2, Section 2, where he talks about that everything in matter is really energy. Yeah, long before Einstein. E equals mc squared, matter really is energy. However, we don't see the energy. We only see the outer. It's like we see the glove, but we don't see the hand inside the glove. And he describes in very vivid imagery how everything in this universe, even the most mineral, even something that's completely inanimate, is pulsating constantly with dynamic energy. And I was describing it. So as an example, I took an orange and I said, you see this orange? It just looks like an orange. There's a peel, there's a fruit inside. You can imagine what it tastes like. You could taste it. But this orange is really just a package of a pulsating energy that is unique. I'll call it orange energy. Okay, and everything in this world is that way. And when you're trained to think that way, you start looking at the world differently. Same thing, look at a human being. Here we look at each other. We're all sitting here in chairs. So the first thing you see is the body, of course, of a person. You see what they look like, their body language, facial expressions, and so on. But all of us know there's a lot more than meets the eye, as you know from yourself. You wouldn't want to be defined or judged just by what you see. What you see is not everything you get. You may be smiling, but who knows, inside you may be crying. You may be crying on the outside, and inside you have a lot of things going on. So how many layers of personality, and let's call it spirit, exist beneath the surface of your body? Meaning the outer surface level. So everyone understands, absolutely. And someone asks you, what's more important, the body or the soul? See, obviously the soul. Let's say a person doesn't first have tears coming out of their eyes and then they start feeling sad. It works the other way around. You feel sad, and that in some way has some physiological, psychosomatic impact on your being, on chemicals, that will will cause teardrops to well up in your eyes. Those are tears. You see a smile on someone's face. It doesn't begin with a smile. It begins with a feeling of contentment or satisfaction. And then, for some reason, that's how the body contorts itself into a smile. But the only way we can understand. So we see each other from the outside in, but all of us see each other from the inside out. So think of the universe just as a large organism. So when it's raining outside, you think it's raining. You take an umbrella, a raincoat. Meteorologists will tell you the pressure systems and the wind velocity, as if, you always hear on the wind reports that the winds are today 24 hours going in the southeast, as if anyone needs to know that. Unless you're sailing, But people like to feel like they know what's going on, When the Weather Channel started, everyone said, who's going to watch weather 24 hours? And, it became one of the most popular and continues to be. I don't know, for some reason, every news broadcast has that little 2-minute, 3-minute section where the guy gets up with a map with a woman, and they're showing you the patterns and so on. I think it makes people feel like they're in control or something. They see where it's really, what's going on behind the surface. Like a kid likes to look what makes a clock tick. I don't know. I'm not going to analyze the psychology of weather.com right now, but you get the idea. So the mystics would take it a step further and say it's raining outside. Maybe it's the angels crying. Not just to be poetic. Maybe it's some type of energy that is just like the energy within our sadness or joy, tears of joy, cause tears to well up. How do you know that that the physiological and weather patterns or other physical phenomena are not a result of spiritual energy? Now, today with modern physics, it's become common. We all know that matter is simply energy that is visible to the naked eye. The simple example would be, you take a piece of wood, it just looks like a piece of wood, throw it into a fire, and suddenly the wood becomes fuel. You take water, you freeze it, it becomes ice. You heat it, it becomes gas, and you can reverse the process many times. So clearly, things are not just what they appear to be. There are many so-called metamorphoses, different forms. So I was discussing all of this, and as I said, I took the orange and I pointed to it, and I started talking about this orange energy. And I remember her name even. She passed away recently. Her name was Michelle. So she says to me, Rabbi Jacobson, are you telling me that you see the energy inside that orange? You feel the vibrations? I said, I can't say I feel it, but I mean, I can relate to it. She says, how much acid did you drop in your life? That was her words. So I said, not at all. I learned Shai Yochid V'Amun. It's a whole text. She says, no. The way you're describing it, you experienced it. You're not just talking academically. And it takes one to know one. Okay? That's her words. And then what happened was an interesting evening unfolded, where she started sharing her LSD trips, as did the others, and it was pretty wild. I did not, because I never had such a trip, but I totally related to it. I was fascinated. I said, imagine you could reach all that naturally without having to do anything. They couldn't believe it. I remember she really could not believe that I could talk about the orange in that fashion. And I remember very, she studied at Berkeley, and in Berkeley, that's where the first LSD tests were made. They were legal. Students volunteered in the late 50s. Until 1965, LSD was legal in the United States. Now, I just want to make it clear, none of you realize you didn't come here to get some type of endorsement of LSD. It's not at all what I'm trying to say. I'm just using that as that was the discussion. I'm actually trying to say that you could experience it without it, So just wanted to make that clear. I don't want complaints from your parents or from your that I'm corrupting anybody, like that type of thing. That's a joke. I know you're all over 18. I understand. So the point I was leading up to was that. So I remember at the end of that class, which was wild, until 3 a.m, and everybody was. It was interesting. Let's put it this way: psychedelic energy was pulsating in that room. That I can tell you that night. In discussion purposes. So I remember afterwards, there was a musician who I know, I still know him, he's still around. He came over to me then, and he said to me, since you've been coming to this class, I've been reading the Torah. I'm about to finish it for the first time in my life, meaning the 5 books, coming to the end of the story. And being that's the first time he read it, for him it's like a whole dramatic unfolding, Like many other people are familiar with it, they know the story, they read it 1,000 times. So it was very interesting to see. He says to me, I must tell you, I thought there'd be a happy ending. This is a very depressing book. Nothing, it's like a nightmare actually. There's not one functional family. Everybody's killing each other. He says, Adam and Eve, the tree of knowledge, brother Cain kills Abel. And then comes the whole other corruption. Then comes the sons of Noah and what they do. And then come the daughters of Lot. And then come then Isaac and Ishmael. And Esau and Jacob. Everybody is either killing each other. He says like the worst soap opera is possible. Nothing works out. And you finally find the house of Jacob, you think, okay, no. The brothers decide to sell their brother into slavery. First they try to kill him first, and then that. And like not one story is like happy. Then you think finally they get out of Egypt. After all that, they come to, he thought, he was convinced that Moses is going to go into Israel, the promised land, because that's the whole point of the whole 5 books. I found it fascinating how he took it personally, and he was reading it like he really wanted to have. He says, and what happens? Moses has to die before they get into the promised land. So what, like, I remember he said to me, what kind of book is this? And he told me, when I read the New Testament, it makes me feel very good. It talks about love and so on. I mean, there are some challenging stories. Other books, and he's very well read. He actually traveled to India those years to become a Swami, which didn't end up happening for other reasons. It's another story of its own. Anyway, and I remember I was smiling because I was just like fascinated to see someone reading it with fresh eyes. I grew up with it from my youngest of age. For me, the stories, not that I take it for granted, but you just don't see it the same way. And I remember it was a very good question that he asked, like not one functional, not one happy ending. Everything ends up with some problem. And as he was asking me, suddenly what struck me was a fascinating insight, and that is exactly what a book of life is about. That's what life looks like. It's not one big happy ending. Life is complicated. And just when you think everything is great, there's another twist, there's another curveball. So if you read a book that makes you feel good, okay, it may make you feel good, it could be inspiring, but it's not necessarily reflective of reality. The Torah is very reflective of reality. It tells you the way it is and does not mince words. It talks about great heights, people reaching unbelievable levels of spiritual growth, nobility, self-sacrifice, kindness, charity. I mean, the most fundamental principles that we believe in human rights, civil rights, are all Torah-based. Loving your fellow as yourself. The concept of charity, of justice. Where did this all come from? It's not an invention of the American founding fathers 300 years ago. This is Torah concepts. If you want to read a fascinating book, read On Two Wings by Michael Novak. A non-Jewish scholar, and I'm just saying non-Jewish because it's not a Jewish, and he makes the case, not a theory, actually. He actually quotes letters, correspondence from the founding fathers, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, Paine, Adams, and so on, quoting them in letters, and he calls it that the basis of the Constitution of the United States in the metaphysics of Torah, not Christianity. That's why you have words like in God we trust, redemption. You don't have words like salvation, savior. You never see any hint of that. They were deists, and they were not embracing that, which is odd because they didn't know any Jews. How many Jews lived here then? Maybe that's why they got it so right, because they got it straight from the sources without, let's put it this way, the filters of Jewish establishment, if you know what I mean. And it's based on Jewish metaphysics. And in fact, you open up a Bible where the concepts, Abraham's dedication to a life of justice and virtue was absolutely revolutionary at the time. Today we take it for granted. It's like democracies are flourishing and so on. We all know it's not perfect, but 500 years ago, 400 years ago, the world was controlled by monarchs, by the church, by despots, by people who, their whim was life and death for anyone. If we were lucky and they were benevolent, great. But we were completely at their mercy. I mean we, not just Jews, all their subjects. And that changed. Today, it's a different world. So the principles are all there, but at the same time, the Torah is not naive. It also deals with the realities of life. That at the heights of spiritual growth and the heights of virtue, a person can become very vicious as well. And the Torah reflects that reality in its fullest sense of the word. So what reflects, let's go back now to the wall, what reflects the reality of this world more, a perfect building or a broken wall? I think it's self-understood what the answer is. Now obviously we all aspire to reaching heights and growing and reaching excellence. But there's something powerful that when we acknowledge that that life is with cracks and that there is a vulnerability and a fragility. Is that the word, fragility? You say fragility? Yeah? Okay. I know fragile. Fragility, fine. Fragility to life. Because it's not about reminding us that we're weak. On the contrary, it's empowering us that you don't need to be perfect to be a godly person. God created us in the divine image, as the Bible makes it very clear, which is the basis, by the way, of all human rights. I would call all people are created equal, even though what they mean in the Declaration of Independence, all men means obviously all men, even though at the time, I don't know if they saw women that way, or blacks that way, etc. But all people are created equal by birthright, by right of the inalienable rights endowed to us by our Creator. As I mentioned, the Founding Fathers were not religious people per se, even though then God was a given much more than it is today. But they weren't trying to push religion because absolutely the separation of religion and state and the freedom of religion. And yet they insisted on putting words like creator, created equal. Why? Until this day, nobody has brought a case to the Supreme Court or anywhere to try to change that. Now think about it. They could have said all people are born equal, or people are equal. Why do they use the word creator and created? It creates a controversial statement. The reason is a very simple one. Because if you don't have that as a birthright from the Creator, and it's given to you by human beings, they could also take it away from you. They needed some absolute. So their deist logic dictated, you need some absolute thing that you cannot come. No majority can come and say, you know what? Only 90% of us are equal, and the 10% are slaves. And the only way you can guarantee that, if they had said all people are born equal, well, who made that statement? If you say it's created equal, and there's a creator that gives us inalienable rights, is exactly the statement taken from the Bible. The human being is created in the divine image. However you explain that. That means we have divine rights, not just human rights. Very, very different. That can never be changed. That's unalterable. It's only absolute, because we're not allowing any person to define that. We're saying it's connected to something greater. The only other place I see God used without problems is insurance policies, by the way. There they have no problem saying, that this insurance policy covers everything except hurricanes, tornadoes, and all other acts of God. So I once asked an insurance attorney, why acts of God? Like, why don't you just say acts of nature? And he told me it's actually quite deliberate, because if it was acts of nature, you could sue the insurance company and say, you know what, why are we responsible for nature? Maybe you should be responsible for nature. But since it's God, it's the perfect scapegoat. It's the acts of God. Go sue God. That's the reason. Check it out. So suddenly acts of God, no problem. Atheists also have these insurance policy. And because it's perfect. God is a perfect scapegoat. You can never summon him. And you just say, God did it. What can I do? It's not my fault. Go to God. Think about that. Anyway, that's a side little footnote. But going back to the theme here, so then the question is the following. When you think of philosophically or psychologically, you find different schools of thought of how we look at ourselves and the human race. Obviously, you cannot ignore the great Sigmund Freud when you talk psychology, even though many people say he's no longer what he once was, and he's been debunked and defamed, or whatever it is. But still, in every conversation, even those that don't agree with him, he's still the point of reference. He's the guy not to agree with. He's like the so-called standard, which I find pretty interesting, because it's only 100 years ago. This Jewish guy, Sigmund Freud, among the other Jewish guys like Albert Einstein, and of course Karl Marx. They say that there were 5 big Jews. There was Moses taught everything was law. Jesus taught, second Jew, Jesus taught everything was love. Freud taught everything was sex. Karl Marx taught everything was money. And Einstein taught everything was relative. That's what they say. Okay. So when you talk about psychology today, yes, the prevalent view, and I say prevalent because I'm not suggesting exclusive, prevalent view is somewhat what some people call, I like to call it the Freudian Darwinian model. They sometimes call Darwin, of course, dealt with natural selection and evolution, but some call Darwin social evolution. The social form of Darwinism, which is what? That, to use the simple term, survival of the fittest. Or to use our good old friends, Richard Dawkins, if you're familiar with him, one of our radical atheists of our time, his classic book, among many books, The Selfish Gene. I don't know if you ever read The Selfish Gene. The title tells you everything. Everything is selfish, even our actual genes. So it's not even a choice. This is how we're wired. Because the first cardinal law of existence is survival. And survival means I need to do whatever I need to do to survive. And if I have to take your piece of bread or your oxygen or your resources, so be it. So many people compare that, the psychological model of Freud, which, using the German word id, the id is the selfish force that drives every human being, particularly called the pleasure principle, particularly around sexuality, and that's your natural, the core of who you are. However, and here there are many different theories, but just let's use the most prevalent one, evolution, whether it's a quirk or it's natural or it's healthy, evolved that human beings developed an ego and a superego, which allows us to coexist. Because if everybody's just going to follow the id, if it's complete survival of the fittest in the raw, naked form of it, we would destroy each other. So it's not, even the selfishness of the gene insists that there be some form of coexistence. So we call red lights and green lights. There's nothing inherent about a red light and green light. You just need rules. Not everybody could be driving the same direction at the same time. So there's a red light and a green light. Nothing, there's no divinity in it. There's nothing absolute about it. It's completely arbitrary. And thus, that defines the human being. Now, when you think about it, if you ever read it, especially in its original sources, it's a very depressing view of the human race. What can you expect today from someone who's a selfish gene? You know, it's true that we try to excel and we try to grow, but if at the end of the day we are evolved bacteria, so what difference does it really make a bacteria that does a mitzvah or doesn't do a mitzvah, or wears a yarmulke or doesn't, or keeps Shabbos or doesn't? Besides the fact that it's depressing in the expectations of the human being, it's also another thing. It absolves us really of ultimate responsibility. Because why expect more? It's a selfish regime. We understand we need courts of law and we need rules and laws to keep a balance. But at the end of the day, really, push comes to shove, we are animals. So really, what expectations are there? Why should there be an expectation? Imagine teaching your children that. I don't really have expectations of you. Just, behave as best as you can. If you can get away with it, make sure that you don't get caught, Obviously, I understand most parents are not going to make that statement exactly because it doesn't sound right. But why doesn't it, if this is indeed the fact? I don't know if you've ever read Schopenhauer, who takes it to the extreme, where he basically dismisses everything. Especially the most blatant is romance itself. He says romance is a complete myth. It's a complete myth. Because if you look at the animal kingdom, there's no such thing as courtship. You don't have to go on dates. There's no wasting money at bars or go to a theater or to this. They do what they have to do. You breed, and the species perpetuates itself. He says it's a quirk of evolution that developed the human being into thinking that we're romantics. He says it clearly, that romanticism is a complete illusion. He says it's a common illusion that everybody likes to embrace. It sounds good, it feels good, it doesn't pass, as they say in Yiddish, whatever. It's not fitting that we're not just two wild animals and just mating. We need, what do you mean? There's a courtship, there's a whole discussion. Are we compatible? And if you just read some of his lines, it's actually quite hilarious for one so tragic. And he dismisses one of the things that we consider the most noble part of us, which is the ability to love another person. He said the whole thing is a myth. To the point that it's actually a cruel, I think he uses the words, he writes in German, but it's a cruel trick of nature just to get two people together to create this romantic illusion. It's like and I hope none of you embrace this theory, but when you read it, you see to what extent, when you take Freudian thought, you take the Darwinian model, and so on, how far it can go. Ends up basically eliminating anything that we consider to be anything sacred, anything refined, anything ethereal. Even if it is, it's only another trick for the selfish gene to get what it needs. So yes, selfishness sometimes dictates cooperating with someone. That's also part of it, because you need something, so you give. So the idea of true noble selflessness doesn't exist. Now, I'm not exaggerating this, by the way. You could check it out. However, you're not going to learn this in school because it doesn't sound very appealing. So no one ever says it in such stark terms. So it's always packaged somewhat in a little more sophistication. Now, take the Torah's view on this. What's the Torah's view on a human being? And this is critical because it affects how we see our lives and how we see also challenges. The Torah view is the exact opposite. The human being is fundamentally created in the divine image. That's the first statement in the whole Bible. It doesn't say we're intelligent creatures, we're emotional creatures, we're sexual creatures. We are created in the divine image. Something divine about us. Male and female as one, and then separated, and then they go search for each other to find that other half of their divine image. That's the picture. And instead of the id being the root of it all, the Jews would say the yid is the root of it all. So Freud got it half right. He knew there was some unconscious or subconscious force beneath the conscious experience that drives our lives. So he got it half right, but he after all had a Jewish mother, which he clearly had issues with, and that defined a lot of his psychology. He should have met some other Jewish mothers. They're not all the same. And so Freud got it right. There is a force beneath, but the question is, how far do you go? Down the rabbit hole. So if you go id, you add a y, a yud, which is a spark, the pintali yid. What's a yud? It's a spark. So he's correct. There is a force that lies in the inherent human being, but that force is a force for good, not a force for selfishness. Now this doesn't deny that we have another voice. If you read the second chapter in the Genesis, that's where the Yetzer Hara is introduced. Yetzer Leva Adam, Ramin Urav. That's only after the flood you read that verse. That's the second verse. Now what is that? That we were created in the divine image. Then there's another part of us. Yes, we all know this. We also have a selfish. I didn't suggest we don't have a selfish side to us, but it's a side. It's a Yetzer Hara. It's not who you are fundamentally. It's a part of who you are. And it could dominate, and it could control your entire life. That's why there's a battle. But it's not necessarily the inherent you. And this is not semantics. This is a fundamental difference of how you look at a human being, expectations of a human being, and responsibility, and how high can we really go. With this approach, you can disguise the limit and beyond, because you have a divine capacity. And if you think that the Jewish people that I mentioned at the beginning of the class are here 3,500 years, 4,000 years, because they follow the selfish gene, trust me, that's for sure not the reason, because they would never have survived. They survived because they knew, and always knew, that no matter what we go through, the divine part of us is indestructible. There's no way that the first philosophy or psychology could ever have lasted, because it's defined by destruction. It's defined by selfishness. Ultimately, someone's going to have to win. Whereas the second approach, which I'm suggesting here, is a whole different approach to life, takes on a different take. Now, the truth is, even though I don't know how much you want to say this in public, or why not? Everything we say, everything open. With Donald Trump out there, you could say anything today, right? So I might as well say what I have to. I'm not comparing myself, He may be the next president, so you better be ready. The Christian view on human being, I would submit. I don't know if I've seen this theory somewhere. Maybe someone wrote it, but I'm not taking credit if it has been written before. But it makes total sense to me that the Christian view on human being, which is somewhat of a bastardization or distortion of the Jewish view, is very similar to these approaches. So even though Freud was Jewish, but I would submit that he was influenced by far more by Christian ways of looking at a human being, including sexuality. So there's a concept in Christianity where they take a biblical story that we as Jews have been reading and studying and analyzing from the beginning of time, called the story of the Garden of Eden, where there's the two trees, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, good and evil. And the way they understand it is the concept of original sin. That once Adam and Eve ate from the tree, basically a toxin entered into existence. The devil was given power. And the only way to redeem yourself, interestingly and ironically, is to believe in a certain Jew. Now, first of all, as Jews, we know believing in Jews is not necessarily going to help you. So I have to share this story, just a very interesting story, and I'll get back to this. I was, after my book, Toward a Meaningful Life, was published, so I traveled. The publisher sent me on a book tour, which first began in 20 cities and ended up in 90 cities. So I was like everywhere. And there were weeks that I literally didn't know whether I was coming or going, because I was in San Diego on Monday, and Tuesday in West Hartford, and then the Wednesday in Boca Raton, and then St. Louis. So all the time zones, I started doing all kinds of tricks on your brain, on your mind, and you're sleeping in this place and that place. I mean, at some point the glamour is gone, and it's just one big pain, to be very honest. I mean, I enjoyed doing the work, but the traveling just was dizzying, to put it mildly. So when you're in a mood like that, you're on a plane, you're either in a mood where you don't want to talk to anyone, or you want to talk to everybody. That's how it works. Everything is extremes. So I happened to be in a mood of talking to everybody. I didn't mean I went around the aisles talking to everybody, but I ended up talking to the guy sitting near me. He ended up being a Methodist pastor, a minister. And he saw I was talkative and welcoming, so he started giving me his whole take on every Christian denomination that exists. And which was interesting. I mean, I thought we had denominations. They have I don't know how many, between the Greek Orthodox and the Southern Baptists and the Northern Baptists and the Mormons and the Quakers. I mean, it's a serious array of. Anyway, we're talking. So then I just decided, enough this education from him. I said to him, "Let me ask you something. What do you think about the Pope?" I think the Pope then was traveling. John Paul was traveling then to New Jersey, if I recall correctly. So he said to me, "Well, we are Protestants. We don't really believe in the Pope and the sacraments and all this stuff." These were his words. Exactly, he said. "We don't believe in intermediaries. We pray to Jesus directly." That's the way he put it. You understand what I just said? Okay. So I looked at him and I smiled and I said, "Oh, yeah. I went to yeshiva with this guy." So he said, "What?" I said, "I went to yeshiva with the man you just mentioned. We studied the same Talmud, the same medrash, the same laws. Why'd you choose him from the entire class? There was a lot of good guys." So he got it. He felt. I was actually intentionally trying to insult him, but he still was friendly. What can I say? So he smiled. He said, "Okay, I understand what you're saying." Anyway, I thought I wouldn't hear from him again. We get off the plane. He runs after me. He says to me, "I like you. Can I get your phone number? You may want to follow up, talk to you at some point." I gave him my number. I never thought I'd hear from him. A few months later, I get a call that they're having a semi-annual conference in it was New Jersey. That was New Jersey, of the Methodist, Presbyterian. They'd like me to be the keynote speaker. I guess they checked me up online. I don't know what it was. So my first reaction to myself was, what are you kidding? I'm not going to. What's the point? What am I doing this? But then I thought to myself, saying, I always like a challenge. So I said to him, I consider it, but 2 conditions. It has to be in a social hall. I don't want to speak in a church. No problem. No issue at all. And second thing, I prefer you don't publicize it. So he said, "Why?" So I said, "Because some of my colleagues may not appreciate this." Okay, so both conditions were met. We arranged it. I ended up coming. The topic they gave me was the Jewish view on Messiah and redemption. And it was clear that I could say, that was why I agreed, because I could say what I want. I wasn't telling them what they want to hear. I was telling them what I want to say, which is fine, no problem. And I did that. I gave them a full presentation, the Maimonides view, the mystical view, that it doesn't require miracles, a change of spiritual consciousness, to use Maimonides' words, that the entire world will be the involvement of the entire world will be nothing but knowing God, using Isaiah's prophecy, Mola'aretz, the world will be filled with divine knowledge as the waters cover the sea. And there will be unity, there'll be nations in the world, all serving one God. Based Tefillah, the Beis Hamikdash, the temple will be the house of prayer for all nations. And I gave an overview of the entire thing. At the end of my talk, the host gets up and thanks me. He says, "Very eloquent. We really can agree with everything you said. It was beautifully presented. However, one problem. You talk about unity. Everyone will be at peace. How will we ever agree about the identity of the Messiah? We Christians clearly have chosen what we would call Yoshka. They call Jesus, whatever. Yoshka Pendrik, some people would call him. And you Jews have categorically and unequivocally rejected him. So how will we ever come to terms about this?" So, I have no idea what I was going to say, but these times you hope that God puts the right words in your mouth, and this is what I said. I said, "Let's put it this way. It's going to be one Jew or another." Anyway, they all laughed very awkwardly, and they accepted it. That's I have to say. So, interesting. So a little footnote to go back to what I was discussing before. So the Christian view is a distortion, frankly, on sin, on the human being, and on sexuality. Even though, if you know a little of your history, the fact that Christians, clergy, are celibate, officially, has nothing to do with religion, it has to do with real estate. I don't know if you know this. In the 9th century, they were not celibate. It was because there were big fights over the buildings and the churches that the children of the priests wanted to inherit. And they didn't all want to go into the clergy. So they decided to abolish marriage, and that's that. So that's a separate footnote. This is, by the way, look it up. This is not a myth. It's not some urban legend. This is fact. But let's, for argument's sake, say it's a spiritual thing. Staying away from sexuality is the ultimate, your relationship is with God alone and no humans. Turn it into a very spiritual thing. In Judaism, not only is that not acceptable, it's forbidden. A high priest, Moses, Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court of Judaism, has to be married. You cannot be celibate, and you cannot be even single, for that matter. You had to be married. Well, that's not a small difference. It's because Judaism never saw sexuality as a negative thing. For Christians, it's a necessary evil. For Jews, it was always a sacred thing. It's that human beings can distort anything. So anything sexual, anything beautiful and holy can also be turned into something ugly. But it's not because it's fundamentally that way. Now, here's not the time, we don't have the time and to go into a whole seminar, which it really deserves, of understanding the implications of two different ways of looking at sexuality. But rest assured that almost every part of our society today is affected by the Christian view of sexuality, even the Jewish perspective, because no one has ever made it clear that it's not the same. Because Christianity has dominated, which is true also about messianic beliefs, it's true about the sin, and it's true about the human being. So though I'm not going to say Freud was directly influenced by Christian thinkers, but he was influenced by Christian culture, which really saw the human being as not a holy entity, that we are fundamentally selfish and we're fundamentally ugly. Doesn't mean we can't do noble things. And that's why you need a Jew to redeem you, which again is ironic, if it weren't so tragic. We Jews don't think that way. There is no Jew that's going to save you. There's no human being that's going to save you. Why? Because you don't need saving. You just need to find your inherent yid, not id. It's a very different approach. If you're fundamentally a bad person, then yeah, how do you get out of your own natural bad evil? You need something from the outside to change you. But Jews never see that person that way. They see a person as fundamentally good. Doesn't mean the good cannot be concealed in layers and layers. But at the end of the day, it's your responsibility and your ability to psychologically free yourself. Now, the implications in my mind are literally life and death difference of attitude. Because it also is a different attitude on looking at a human being. Looking what we're capable of. One is we're weak and dirty and unclean. And maybe, so we need some redemption or something like that. The other is that we're fundamentally divine agents in this world with the ability to achieve anything we want to achieve. It's very, very different. And I would say psychologically, if you go to a therapist that says to you, you know something, I don't think we're ever going to really reach any great heights. You're damaged goods. I mean, I don't think any therapist is going to put it in those terms. But let me just cut to the chase. I'll put it, you're damaged goods, you were abused, you were hurt, you were violated. So what I'm going to do with you is at least we'll do some damage control so you shouldn't feel suicidal every day. Like, for example, there are people who tell me, sadly, people tell me, I said, once when I was a younger person, I was idealistic, I was dreaming, I had imagination, I wanted to achieve who knows what, I can't conquer the world. Today, if I come home after work and I feel no one beat me up, I feel that's an accomplishment. You want to cry when you hear that our standards get lower and lower because we've been hurt. And I understand when you're hurt in life, and you have people who say, "What? Don't get so disturbed. I'm more hurt than you are." Misery loves company, so the standard gets lower. Today with social media, everything's amplified. So everyone's misery is advertised everywhere. So not so bad. Everybody else is miserable, so I don't feel so bad. But what does it do to the collective consciousness, and what does it do to individually? You lower your bar. That enthusiasm, that excitement, that exuberance of life. Most people, by the time they're a certain age, you don't see it anymore. They don't see the sparkle in the eye. I mention this all the time, to ad nauseum even, but I think it's important to mention. I have a few grandchildren now. And of course, grandchildren you seem to have more time to appreciate than your own children, whatever reason that is. It's another discussion. And I observe them. Not just them, I observe all children that come my way. What I mean by observe, because they're the most natural and most pure form of ourselves. You want to see you in the purest form? Look at a child. So in technology, an iOS, an iPhone version 6 is better than version 5, and 5 is better than version 4. But in human beings, I would submit version 1 is better than version 2. And the older we get, it's more downhill, not uphill. I mean downhill as degrading, devolving, whatever. And this I say with all due respect to myself, to all adults sitting in this room. What you see in a child, you see the real you. Like the freshly fallen snow, before it's been trampled on, before it's been jaded, before it's been impacted by disappointments and duplicity and hostility and this violation, that violation. I'm talking about everyone, even if you grew up in an ideal home. Life is challenging. Go to work, you see people you thought you could trust, only you don't trust them. What people will do when they're greedy and selfish. You know, in the beginning you're shocked, and then you start. So sometimes the question, what's worse, when you're shocked or when you stop being shocked? When you're shocked, at least you still think that there's a better world. And when you stop being shocked, it's even worse, because now you think that's how it is. In the olden days in Russia, in other countries, there was no air conditioning, so it was very unbearable hot days. They would go there and have these basements, these cellars. We'd go down for some relief. But there was also no electricity, so it was dark. But, you know, you tolerated the dark to get some relief from the heat. So they told the story of a chassid who once went down to one of these basements, these cellars. So it was relatively cool. But when he came down, he says, it's so dark, I can't see anything. So he hears a voice, because he can't see anyone. He hears a voice. Someone said, don't worry, you stay here for a while. You'll get used to it. So he said, that's exactly what I'm worried about. I don't want to get used to it. You know, to the point where toxic air becomes natural. And someone gives you some healthy air, and you think there's something wrong. So when you look at children, what you see the unbelievable enthusiasm. Everything is exciting. You give, a grandson, he went back, my daughter lives in California with her 3 children. They were just here till yesterday. My grandson is 15 months old. Everything you give him is exciting. We look for all kinds of novelties. We're bored. We're this. We're couch potatoes. You know, we've mastered the art of sedentaryism. Is that another word? Sedentaryism? Okay. Are you an English professor or something? Really? I think it's your tie that gave you away. Just kidding. I know, but let's put it sedentary. It was called the couch potato. The art of doing nothing. You know, you talk about animals and humans. We are the only ones that have mastered the art of doing nothing. The joke goes, there's this old Jew sitting on a bench. He's all depressed, and his friend comes over. What are you so depressed? He says, my wife is very angry at me. What's so surprising? She's always angry at you. No, today really, what happened? She went to work this morning. She asked me, what are you going to do today? And I said, nothing. She said, you said that yesterday. So I told her I wasn't finished, you know? Okay, I wasn't finished doing nothing. Okay, so nothing has also become now an achievement. And it's really against human nature. A human being is mobile. And I don't mean by mobile as mobile phones. I mean mobile. Life is constant flux. There's a doctor who comes here, often a cardiologist, and he has a difficult life. He's gone through an ugly divorce, all kinds of stuff. And he tells me, Rabbi, give me a blessing that I should just have a day of peace. I want total peace. So I said, what do you mean, like a flat line? He said, no, not a flat line. You know, you don't want a flat line. That you don't want. You want, what does a heartbeat look like? Waves, peaks and valleys, equanimity. However, ups and downs, that's life. A pulsating heart, a beating heart, contraction, expansion. You breathe, exhale, and inhale, that's life. And nobody wants to stop that. So the human being by nature is in flux, constant movement. So imagine what does it do to our psyche and soul when a person freezes that and you become now, I'm doing nothing for the next 5 hours. Now I understand the temptation because we live a stressful life. So what's the opposite of stress? Is doing nothing. You know, But what does it do to the spirit that needs that type of restlessness in a good way? Healthy angst. Not saying anxiety, healthy angst. So children are an excellent model. If you want to see, juxtapose yourself over a child, and you'll see everything that's, let's put it this way, but that's right with the child and it's wrong with us. This doesn't mean hope is lost. It means that we need to get back and understand the standards that we're capable of. And unfortunately, the society in which we live today has lowered those standards to the point that we have become less, we don't expect as much because, hey, human beings are selfish gene. What do you want? So forget about whether one believes in God or not, but I would say this, from an argument point of view, a purely ideological argument, the idea of a God, the idea that a human being is in the divine image means that the sky and beyond is the limit. And if not, then we are basically the same subject to the same natural limits that everything else in this world is like. So I'm not getting now into academic and empirical proofs. I like experiential proofs, are far better, more effective. What do you expect of yourself? Would you rather someone believe in you that you can do everything? Or you want someone to say, I don't expect anything from you. If you do a little more, I'll be happy. And I think it's important to surround ourselves with people like that. Now, this is also regarding dealing with illness and challenges. Because if at the end of the day, our expectations of ourselves are low, and we are just creatures of survival, what do we call it? Victim of circumstances, product of circumstances, better than victim. Same idea, but it sounds better. We're a product of circumstances, so fine, you get sick, God forbid, ill. So it just feeds into your own lack of self-worth. What's the surprise? You see two people in the hospital, one has, God forbid, no visitors, no guests, no gifts, nobody comes and sees them. And you have the same person lying the other side of the room that's full of guests and full of gifts and people coming. They have exactly the same illness. You tell me, can you predict what's going to happen to both of them medically? Pretty much you could predict. Obviously there are exceptions. But when you don't have someone coming and reassuring, you have nothing to live for. Why would you fight? Today we know that there's a chemical called adrenaline. It's a real chemical. It's not a placebo. That has an effect when you are excited. When you have people around you that believe in you, you have people around you that give you hope, it has physical impact on your life. Without question. Again, I'm not suggesting nothing guaranteed in this world, but if you talk about a fighting chance, why? Because what does it do? It gives you that willpower, the will to fight. Everyone knows the O. Henry story with the leaves, right? The leaves fall off the tree. The guy's like he's terminally ill. Doctors gave up hope. He's lying in his bed, hospital, but I don't remember the whole story, but I remember he's lying in his bed. And when you're lying in a place where you can't move, you get fixated on images, and outside his window was an image. Not an image, it was a tree. So in the summer, the tree was in full bloom, beautiful. But he began to identify with the tree as the fall came, the autumn came, and the leaves began to fall. He began to identify himself with that tree. And every leaf that fell, to him was like he was falling as well. And in his mind, he said, when the last leaf of this tree falls, I will die. Again, I remember all the twists and turns in the O. Henry story, but I remember the end of it is that somebody who realizes it decides to go and paint a leaf on the window. So he should never see. So even when all the leaves fell, he just always saw one leaf. And he was fixated on this leaf the whole winter. He was waiting for the morning would come. He'd wake up and the leaf, as soon as he woke up, he was looking for the leaf. And the leaf never fell. So I think he never died. At least not in that story. But the idea, I don't remember again, the details, I may have botched it a bit, but the theme, the punchline is definitely that. Because that's what it is. I remember I was a kid, when I was a teenager, I suffered from what's called allergies. Ragweed, hay fever, I don't know what they call it, hay fever. Any of you had ragweed, hay fever issues? You get older a little, it starts abating. But I remember one summer, I was in Detroit in a summer camp, and there was a real serious ragweed season, I guess, and I had literally an asthmatic attack. I couldn't breathe. My air canals were constricted. So the infirmary, they gave me something to just open it up, and they told me, you got to go to a doctor, it's a serious allergy. So after I got back to New York, there was a famous allergist, his name was Dr. Redner, those good old days, and I went to see him. He gave me these tests. These scratch tests. pollen, this pollen, that pollen, dust, some other things. And dust, I remember in Ragwe, both really blew up. And I had another attack right there in his office because I was so sensitive. So he immediately gave me an injection of something, and everything went away. And I don't know if you know, if you have allergies, in the middle of a beautiful, breezy summer day is like a nightmare for allergies. It's not life-threatening, but it's not going to be because the wind, carries the pollen. And suddenly that beautiful summer day turned into heaven. Whatever he gave me got rid of every allergy. So I said, what are we doing all these tests for? Why don't you just give me what you inject me with? He said, adrenaline. I kid you not, adrenaline. So I said, adrenaline? He says, yeah. I can't keep giving it to you because you'll build up immunity and then you'll need more and more and it could be dangerous. So I said, that's adrenaline. So I asked him a question. I said, I have an interesting phenomenon. I was working then, some of you may know, it was a very intense work. I was working for the Lubavitcher Rebbe, but the job was on Shabbos and holidays when he spoke, and there were no tape recorders and no notes, so the job was to remember hours and hours of these talks. And then after Shabbos and the holiday, to document it and publish it. That's what I did for 14 years. Very difficult and intense work. But I remember Sundays, which was the hardest day of the week for that type of work, after Shabbos, I never suffered from allergies that I could remember. So I used to think I was so busy I didn't notice, So I said, is it possible that when a person has an adrenaline rush, due to whatever work they're involved, that natural adrenaline actually minimizes the effects of the allergy? Like you just gave it to me in an injection. He said, absolutely. He said, did you ever notice an interesting thing he told me? He says, you ever see a concert pianist or a Hollywood actor or opera singer ever sneeze on stage for 4 hours, 5 hours, 3 hours? And it's not recorded. We're talking about live performance. He says, you know why? Because when the adrenaline is running, you have a supernatural control, superhuman control over your faculties. So that's why people say, I'm going to wake up 6 o'clock in the morning. They can wake up on the dot without an alarm clock. Because there's certain chemicals in the body that have control over your faculties much more than people think. The problem is, it's not, you have to be able to have that type of focus and have real adrenaline running. You can't just fake it. But I remember, I never forgot the story. I said to myself, something? That means if a person technically jumps out of bed every morning and is excited about what they do, why would it not be natural that they may have a healthier life? Because it affects their juices, it affects their whole being. Again, I'm not talking about, God forbid, anybody can be hurt, illness, there's accidents. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about all things equal. Equal level playing field. And like I said, the person lying in the, God forbid, sick and has people come, encouraging, hope, there's reason to live. You have children, you have grandchildren, you want to dance at their wedding. It has to have an impact. And God forbid, the opposite is also true. So this whole, what I discussed earlier, the collective so-called psychological and philosophical models of a human being, of sin, of sexuality, actually can have a major impact on how we see ourselves and how we fight challenges, including illnesses and including psychological challenges and all the other stuff. Because if at the end of the day you see yourself as a gem, you see yourself as a divine agent, you see yourself as creating the divine image, and you really, really know that in your gut, you look at life very differently. A challenge then is something to overcome. If, however, you loathe yourself, or you have no self-confidence, and you see yourself as just another negligible component of existence, then how much are you really going to fight? How much does it really matter? And we live in a world where you need to be reminded all the time that you really matter. I have the favorite line that I use from my book: birth is God saying you matter. Your life matters. And not just to you and to your loved ones and to your friends. It matters on a cosmic level and forever and ever. And this is also a fundamentally Jewish concept, which frankly is a universal one for all people, all 7 billion people on this planet. You fundamentally matter. And to put it in very blunt terms, if you're a child, or you ask yourself the skeptical question, who really cares if I'm going to be a better person, a more virtuous person? Yeah, maybe it makes me feel good for the day. And at the end of the day, we're all going to die. We'll all be buried. The same worms will eat us all. I don't mean to be so morbid. What difference does it really make? What are you going to tell a child? So the usual prerequisite answers you hear are, is the right thing to do? That's what God wants. You feel better this way. They're different. But these are all, be very honest, not adequate answers, at least not in my mind. Because what difference does it really make? If you can get away with it? I see wicked people, cruel people prospering. The classic questions, the wicked prosper, the good suffer. So what difference does it make? Everything is temporary in this world. Everything is mortal. Life will end. And then what? The Torah answer, the Jewish answer, is based on the principles I said till now. And that is, no. The good deeds you do never end. When you do a good deed, when you are virtuous, you change the world forever. The energy that's released never dies. And that's why, yes, it was worth that Abraham and Sarah, and Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah and Rachel, and all the great giants of our ancestors, they sacrificed their lives. Even the 6 million Jews, to say they died in vain, that now they're dead, who cares? No, every act of a person lives on forever. And Jews always knew that. That's why we cherished the memory, not just the memory, but the actions of the Mesiras Nefesh, the sacrifices that our ancestors made, because it does not die. Their bodies may have died, but their sacrifices do not. And we, as their children, inherit that legacy, and we stand as midgets on their shoulders. And it's a long marathon that we would not be who we are today had they not paid that price. So it does not die. And when we believe in Mashiach and the concept that there's an end, it's not just a nice, good, happy ending. It's telling us that every price paid, every good deed done from the beginning of time is a building block that when it accumulates, you will have a perfect world. So Messianic age is, again, very different than a Christian. Christians see Messiah as an event. Jews always saw it as a process that led to an event. Every good deed right now, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, was one building block in a big edifice that would turn the world into a better world. And something? It did. This world today is far more humane than it ever was. It has its challenges. And when you look close up, you sometimes think these challenges are the worst ever. But if you think collectively in history, that especially for Jews, we could sit here in a class, send our children to any school we like, and not be persecuted as Jews. This is a miracle. Many people would call this Messianic because the Talmud says the only difference between Shmuel says the only difference between Mashiach and the present time is Shibud Malchus, which means basically being under the yoke of hostile governments. I know some people think the IRS and paying parking tickets are in that category, but let's be honest. Compare that to Stalinist Russia, to Hitler's Europe, Germany, etc., to the pogroms, the inquisitions, the crusades, etc., etc. Again, we still have work to do, but it's a different way of looking at life. So it's like seeing everything is ultimately at the core positive and divine. Now, what happens outside the core is the layers that add on. I mentioned this a number of times. It just captures it so well. A few years ago, before Rosh Hashanah, I got a note from a woman. Rosh Hashanah, Happy New Year greeting. She writes to me, it was a very difficult year she went through. She was living in Austin, Texas, and went through a very difficult divorce. Ended up in Seattle. And she says it was just horrible. One of the redeeming factors every week was my weekly email. It would be like a glimmer of hope. Gave her like a ray of light that would come to her home. She always looked forward all week to it. She wanted to thank me. And then she concluded, she said, I'm a sculptor by profession. And Michelangelo, the sculptor of all sculptors, once said, when he was asked, how do you carve those beautiful angels in the marble? And he answered, I see the angel trapped in the marble, and I carved and set her free. And she concludes, so thank you for setting my angel free. So I don't know, Michelangelo was clearly not Jewish, but he was very influenced by Jewish teachers where he lived. I don't know if you saw the book by Bleich called The Secrets of the Sistine Chapel, something like that. It's a very interesting book. You saw it? Huh? You published it. Huh? Oh, wow. Who else is in the room here? You never know. Okay. Good. Well, it's an interesting book. So Michelangelo which his name actually means Michael, the angel Michael, which is our archangel, our good angel. Arch is not good. Arch is not good. Our angel is Michael. So, if you think about the line, it's a brilliant line, and it really captures a very Jewish theme. That we are all angels at heart, soul. Divine image, as I said. We're all a flower. Each of us a unique flower, a unique music, song. And however, it sometimes gets trapped in marble. And sometimes in concrete and in other substances. I'm not going to list all the possible substances. You could fill in the blanks. And what happens to the angel? It remains intact. There's an expression in the Talmud, Afal pi shachata Yisrael, which means even if one sins and one wanders away, they always remain fundamentally a Yisrael, a Jew. That's the way it is. Because good can never be obliterated. Good can be concealed. Evil is temporary. That can be obliterated because it's not fundamental to existence. So essentially the world is a good place. And people are good people, but they can be trapped. And that trap could be very intense. And it could dominate a person's life. I'm not suggesting criminals in prison also have a pure soul. But at the end of the day, we say every morning in the prayer, the soul you've returned to me. Thank you for returning my soul, Modani. And then we say, Neshamas and Nesatabi, the soul you've given me, you've returned to me. Tahorihi is pure. Every person says that, no matter how impure you may be. So it can't be saying a lie. It means because at the heart, that's what it is. So you have what to work towards. So now the question is, can you access it? Can you re-access it? So your newborn children, that's all they have. That shines. That's why they're so pure. That's why we see that, the innocence. Then life starts affecting them. Think of the first time you've ever lied. You'll never remember it because once you lie, you're now on the other side of the fence. You don't remember what was on the other side. You don't remember when you lose your innocence because once you lose it, you're no longer innocent. Just like you don't remember when you become subjective. Once you're subjective, you're no longer objective. So, but when do we lie for the first time? When we see adults around us lie. Children do not know how to lie. That's why parents have to always tell them, don't say everything you see. Because children, what you see is what you get. We see it as almost naivete. They're stupid. They're not. It's not true. They're just pure. They're seamless. Where did we get the concept of duplicity in the first place? Why do we accept that as a norm that you could say one thing and mean something else, that you could smile to someone and stab them in the back? But it became common. Everyone's doing it. But Judaism and the Torah always maintained the standard. Just because everybody's doing it doesn't mean it's natural. It doesn't mean it's healthy. It just means that people all bought into the same low common denominator. It's like everybody arguing on television why the standard's so low. So the television producers say, because that's what the audience wants. The audience says that's what they're feeding us. No one knows where it began. And the advertisers are all happy as long as you have people watching. So in that context, when you have those standards as high as possible, it changes how you look at yourself, how you look at life, and you look at our challenges. So I hope I did some justice to this. Now, why did I call half is more than whole? When half is more than whole? Because, as I said before, the broken heart, as the Chassidic masters say, there's nothing stuck. There's nothing as complete as a broken heart. This Parsha, this coming Shabbos, we read, in addition to Vayakel, which is the chapter that talks about gathering the Jews together, and the Shabbos, and then the temple, was also, we read a second chapter, second Torah scroll will be taken out because it's the month that blesses, it's the Shabbos that blesses the new month of the second Adar. This year is a leap year, so Adar is the second month of joy. Purim, the month of Purim, but we read Parsha Shekalim, which actually we read last week as well. What's Shekalim? Shekalim means that when they build the temple, the sanctuary, the portable sanctuary called the Mishkan, and same thing later with the temple in Jerusalem. So there were different donations and contributions were made. There were some that were made, the wealthy gave more, those that less wealthy gave less. Like we know, like tithing. So tithing is percentage based on your income. But then there was one exception called the Machzis HaShekel, that everyone, Ha'osher LaYarbe, Hadal LaYamit, everyone equally had to give the same half a coin, We commemorate this on Tainus Esther, the day before Purim, Mincha prayer and afternoon prayer. We commemorate this mitzvah. With that, everyone had to give a half a coin, and the expression is machzis hashekel, half a coin. Of course, everyone asks, why half? We know in Judaism, especially in holiness, everything has to be a dover shalom, complete. In the temple, there was no waste. So why would you do something that's half? It sounds you're going to give to God, give with a full heart, give something complete, give a full coin. Why a half a coin? So there are many, many explanations for it. But one of the most beautiful one is, one of the most eloquent and beautiful one is about, it's a lesson in life. You're not complete without another. At the end of the day, the most complete person is the one that recognizes that they're only a half. The other half could be God, the other half could be your spouse, the other half could be your community. It means that, in the words of Hillel, Imena nili mili, if I'm not going to be for myself, who will be for me? Okay, so that's self-reliance. And then you have the second half of the statement. Imanila atzmi, if I'm only for myself, ma'ani, what will I be? What am I? Meaning that we can all be an indispensable musical note in a large cosmic composition. And you must play your note. Nobody can do it for you. But you also know there's other notes that complement you, and that's what makes it into a symphony. And that's the understanding that the whole half is more than whole. To someone to say, I'm a whole person, I don't need anybody, I've reached all the knowledge I can gain, I've reached perfection. What would you think about someone who gave you that type of resume? Yeah. You wouldn't, it speaks for itself. The most beautiful thing is to hear someone say, I'm in flux, I'm on a journey, I'm in movement, You know the greatest compliment you tell a person in the scholarly world in Judaism? You don't call them a chacham. If you call someone a chacham, which means a wise person, it usually means like a smart aleck, a know-it-all, a chacham, chacham from Manishtan, he thinks he's so smart. You know the ultimate compliment? You wouldn't believe this. Talmud Chacham. To be a student of a wise person. The greatest sages are called a Talmud Chacham. Think about that. They always remain a student. As much as they are a teacher to thousands and they're Talmud Chacham. It means they're a student of wisdom. They're a student, Reishis Chachma Yiras Hashem. The beginning of wisdom is awe of something greater than you are, of God. Every Talmudic volume begins on page 2. There's no, page 1 is blank. Page 1 is dedicated to humility. You don't be such a chacham, you're not so smart and complete. First acknowledge that I am empty. Then you can begin to retain. We say it every day, 3 times a day in the Amidah prayer. Nafshi ka'ofar la'koyel tiyeh, psachli b'beseresach. My spirit is like dust to all, meaning humble. And you open my heart to Torah. Your heart opens when you empty yourself. If you're a full cup, there's nowhere to fill anything. You're already full, you're already complete. So the most beautiful thing in understanding growth in a human being is understanding, yes, being self-confident. We're not talking about being a shmata, being a doormat, and lack of self-esteem. In Judaism, there's a word for, Anov means a humble person. Shafal means a person of low self-esteem. To the naked eye, they may appear the same, but they're very different. Humility comes from strength, and low self-esteem comes from weakness. One is demoralizing, and one is uplifting. One motivates you to reach great heights, and the other is destroys you. Moses considered Anav Makol Adam. He was the humblest. What was that meant? Humblest. He didn't know he was a great man. He didn't know that God chose him. He didn't know that he knew a few things about Torah. But he always said to himself, these are not my gifts. God gave them to me. Had God given someone else the gifts he gave to me, they would have done better than I. That's a humble person. Not delusional. He knows very well who he is. But he does not see himself as a self-made person. He sees himself as a channel to something greater. Channeling, transparent channel to something greater than him or herself. So Machzis HaShekel, this, when you read it this weekend, think about it. Think whether you can align yourself. Do you see yourself as a full coin or as a half a coin? And this, of course, is the secret to all relationships. You're a complete person, you probably won't have room for another person in your life. Men have this problem more than women, I find, naturally, but women have learned to emulate men, unfortunately. There was this, I mentioned this a number of times, it just always struck me. So this little girl sees her mother was pregnant and says to her mother, how do you have room inside yourself for another life? I don't know what the mother answered, but I thought of the question. I said to myself, interesting. You know, men don't even have room for someone outside of them. And here a woman, not just physiologically, psychologically, it's not just like in a little closet. Your whole body is occupied by another life. Occupied territory. Maybe that's not a good way to put it. Sorry. Doesn't sound so good. And then I only can marvel at it. I can't tell you I naturally ever felt or experienced it. But I find it to be an interesting thing. Having room inside of you for another person makes you a greater person, not a lesser person. So this idea, my space, don't come into my space. It says me. So of course all of us need our space. And I'm not suggesting anyone should intrude or an assault on everybody needs their privacy, so to speak. But don't get so consumed with it. You know, don't get so consumed with yourself. It's all about me. Me, me, me. You know that word. Okay. So that's so in the summation of it all, I think we have hopefully I try to convey I guess a philosophical approach that's consistent throughout, that affects how we look at ourselves, how we look at challenges, how we look at illness. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to we're looking to reveal the inner flame, the inner flower that is waiting for us to fan those flames. It's there. And that's really what it comes down to. I would think if every therapist and every school of psychology would take that approach, you'd have a lot more healthier people. We have given up on people in a certain way. We almost don't expect as much because, this happened, that happened. And I'm not saying not being sensitive to what we've gone through. Obviously, people who have endured or suffered greatly need compassion. But compassion doesn't mean you suddenly think that you think less of them, and you say nothing to expect of them because look what happened to them. I would suggest if I was a friend to someone, I would like to believe, if someone was my friend, that I would like to believe that I would invite them to kick me in the pants and say, become much better because I believe that you can do a lot better than you are. At the same time of having the compassion for what we've gone through. And this type of almost like enabling weakness and enabling and justifying low expectations is not necessarily helpful for the human dignity of a person. Now, obviously, this is case by case, and I'm not just making one blanket statement. Again, I say it again with the right sensitivity. Someone who's hurting, you don't suddenly come and tell them, hey, get your act together and stop hurting. You have to hold their hand, you have to cry with them, you have to go through whatever they have to go through. That's not my point. My point is, but ultimately, you want to say to them, you know something? I'll never understand what you've gone through, but I can tell you, I think you can, you can reach heights that none of us have ever reached. And I've seen this with my own eyes. I've seen people who've suffered tremendous loss and trauma, and when they work on it and they get to higher places, the refinement of someone who's suffered abuse, there's no refinement you'll find in the world as the refinement that someone who's gone through the fire. I'm not saying it's challenging, and I'm not saying it's not challenging. I'm not saying it's even something we want, but we're talking about after the fact. And I think it all comes down to really the dignity and respecting the majesty and dignity of a soul. That each of us sitting here, each of us, wherever you may be, have a soul, a divine soul. It's a piece of God. It's not some game. It's absolutely indispensable. It's not negligible. It's not optional. It's not arbitrary. It's real. And the way the world is waiting for you to do your thing. The world is waiting for you to sing your song. They say, Thoreau writes, most men lead lives of quiet desperation. And urban legend has in the second half, but it's not his, it comes from a different poem. I've done a little research, but the second half is even more devastating. Most men lead lives of quiet desperation, and they die with their song still inside them. Now, is that not sad? That's what we do not want to do. To die with your song still inside you. I know it sounds foreboding, but my point obviously is we're all, thank God, alive and kicking, and we all have plenty, a big bright future ahead of us. You have in you unbelievable resources. You have in you strengths that you do not know. Who knows how much strengths we have? We can never know. And you and your friends and the community and the world, in a way, are waiting for you to be the best you can be. And surround yourself with people who believe in that. Don't surround yourself with people who are always saying, don't get so excited, don't be so enthusiastic, those type of people don't do a lot of good service for us, even though you may consider them your best friends. But it's good to have some fresh air of some people who can say to you, you know something, I believe in what you want to do, and go for it, fight for it, push it. Obviously, again, it has to be measured, realistic, and so on. But maybe I'd rather err on the side of more dreaming than the other side, of being too realistic. So God bless everybody here with that ability to actualize your inner soul and recognize that when you feel that you're half, that's when you start becoming complete. When you know that you don't know, that's when you start getting complete. You start climbing the mountain, you see the horizon is it's far beyond you ever imagined. Then that's when the growth begins. And at the same time, we have to have the balance of knowing that we have to feel, as I think the Alter Rebbe said it once, or Shneur Zalman said, you have to know how small you are and how great you can become. So, again, we dedicate the class to mother and wife to have a complete refuah shlema. Please see myself and the Meaningful Life Center as, I guess, a friend, a resource in this glorious journey called Intersecting Souls, which we're doing now. And hopefully some of the words said here will resonate and have a long-term, not permanent, impact. I hope that, I tried to say this. I don't believe I'm sharing my own words. I try to share what I was taught, share what is said in the Torah, ideas that have been passed on generation after